Our speaker this morning is the executive director of the Dallas Willard Center. Probably most of you are still not quite sure exactly. You probably heard about it. Well, I'm going to tell you what it is in just a few words. But basically what you need to do over the next months and time you're here is listen and get acquainted with Gary Moon. Gary is executive director. Dallas Willard, for some of you, might be a name you don't know, but he's been chairman of the Department of Philosophy at USC. He has written widely on matters concerning how we are formed in the image of Jesus Christ. He brings a powerful intellect and a warm, godly heart to this whole thing. And it's been his concern that spiritual formation, Christian growth, things like that would have the intellectual rigor needed to really speak to the whole world and be in dialogue with other religions. And that's why Westmont College has established this center. And Gary is its executive director. He is a wonderful man. He is his wife, Regina. You've got to get to know these people. They are treasures. And so this is your first shot, or most of us anyway. Gary, we welcome you in the name of Christ, and may you have a lot of fun as you speak to us this morning. Let's welcome him. Yeah.
Thank you, Ben. Appreciate it. It's good to see all of you. It's quite an honor to be here. I know two things about chapel talks that are very important. You need a beginning, you need an ending, and you need to put those two as close together as possible. So I'm aware of that. In fact, I want to start right off the bat with a commercial, if you don't mind sharing that with us, Brad. Well, the reason I want to share that with you, not just because it's somewhat politically incorrect, but it relates. In fact, it's the title here, Is It Time to Rethink Our Thinking? I'm sure you've all played the game where you've got about 20 people or so in a circle, and someone starts the conversation with a sentence, and it goes all the way around the room, and then it's kind of funny how it ends up. I sort of think that there was a conversation that began at the time of Jesus and in the first few centuries of the church that's gotten passed down through the centuries, and it's not so funny how it's ended up 20 years later. I want to make a case for that and then talk about, is there something we can do about that? I mean, then, it was pretty impressive. Christians were willing to face hungry lions. The world looked on and said, look how they love each other. And they were able to permeate the dominant culture of the day. Today it seems more like Christians leave church early to go watch the lions. People often seem to look on and say, look how they quarrel and bicker and hate. And we're sort of taken over by popular culture. In fact, there are a couple of questions, thanks for going to the next slide, that have haunted me for a long time. I'm a psychologist that's been interested in spiritual formation for a couple of decades plus, and these questions haunt me. If Jesus came to turn the world right side up, why do so many of his followers continue to live such upside down lives? And if Jesus came to plant love and peace and joy, why do so many of us grow anger and depression and anxiety? And why does survey after survey find so little difference between Christians and non-Christians? Divorce rates are about the same among Christians versus non-Christians. In fact, some studies show that domestic violence is actually higher among Christians. Non-Christians give 2.4% to charity. Christians, 2.6%. All the sermons on tithing seems to have produced about 0.2% of difference. I'm from Southeast Georgia. You may have already picked that up. And where I am from, we lead the country in conservative politics, conservative religion, and internet downloads of pornography. I'm aware of a fairly recent study that indicates twice as many, 11%, of pastors admit to having had an affair as opposed to psychologists. And with many fingers pointing back at myself, why after a few decades at this do I find Romans 7 so much empathy for my own state in Romans 7? And there's worse news. If we go to the next slide, most of you are probably familiar with the book Unchristian by Kinnaman and Gabe Lyons. These are some of his findings in surveying people around your demographic here. 16 to 29-year-olds outside the church associate Christianity with judgmentalism, hypocrisy, homophobia, insensitivity, political extremism. They found that only 3% of those surveys had a positive association with the word evangelical. And this means that a generation of young people is coming of age who are simply unfamiliar with the church. They view it as an institution that actually impedes the formation of producing truly excellent people. Dallas Willard summarizes it this way. I try to limit my quotes of Dallas to 2 per 30 minutes, so this is the first one. There are no words there. I'll bring those in. All of the talk about transformation appears to ordinary Christians today like distant galaxies in the night sky, visible somehow, but inaccessible in the conditions of life as we know them. Hence, we rarely meet a Christian actively engaged in the transformation as depicted in the Bible. So, what can be done? Well, Regina and I have really enjoyed getting to know Santa Barbara, and that after 7 months of trying, we haven't met anyone yet that we don't like. So it seems like a pretty good situation. So I was driving the coast road in, whatever that little road is, the main drag, and I noticed this place of business that was advertising French lessons, and that struck me because we wouldn't see that in rural Georgia. You wouldn't think that a business could make it, downtown, just teaching French or any other language for that matter. But I'm aware that if it works, and it seems to be working, looks like they've been there a while, 3 things are very important. People will come to that place with a vision for what it means to speak French. They'll really want to have a vision, an image for that happening in their life. They will intend to do so, and then the place provides the means. I want to use that same model, arguably the model that's used for learning anything, VIM. We don't learn anything complicated without vision, intention, and means, and take a look back and at today. In the church of the first few centuries, salvation was seen a bit differently than I think it sometimes is seen today. If we bring in the next slide, John 17:3. This is how the church of the first few centuries saw salvation itself. This is taken from the high priestly prayer of Jesus right after his commencement address to his disciples. And this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you sent. Now you know that the word know is a pretty important word. In fact, I'm not sure I can tell you about it without blushing a little bit, but it's the same word for sexual intercourse. To intimately know the Trinity, basically. Righteous Father, and continuing in verse 25. Righteous Father, the world has not known you, but these know you, and know you have sent me. I made known to them your name, and I will make it known, that the love with which you have loved may be in them, and I in them. Now, Paul got that. In fact, it can be successfully argued that the Apostle Paul had a number 1 teaching theme in his writing, and it was Christ in you, or you in Christ. 164 times Paul uses one of those 2 phrases, Christ in you. If we go to the next slide, the great iconographer Rublev drew this image to depict the Trinity. It's taken from the Old Testament, actually, and Abraham encountering the 3 angels, but he uses that to portray the Trinity. Salvation was pulling up a chair at this table. If you look over the central figure, that's the Christ figure of the Trinity, Jesus. Over his shoulder, the tree of life. If you follow a line straight down, through his hands, 2 fingers indicating fully human, fully divine, through the chalice, and a little square under the chalice represents the empty tomb, and flowing from the Trinity is a river of life. Salvation in the early church was pulling up a chair at the table, putting your feet in the river of life, and being part of the conversation, knowing the Trinity, entering into a transforming friendship on a daily basis with the Trinity. In fact, baptism in the early church, well, it's this way now as well, but it's a little bit more easy to see then. It wasn't about getting sinners wet. In fact, it was a lot more about The Matrix. I'm referring to the movie, not the last two, they were awful, but the first one in the Matrix series, where there are these two realms. So that stops when it's time for me to, no, anyway. There were these two worlds, and you step from one into the other. Baptism was being baptized into the life of the Trinity, entering into a whole new way of existence. It was a little different for me. I remember, quote unquote, getting saved when I was about 5 years old. I was at a church in rural Georgia. I'm not saying it was way out in the country, but you would have to drive back toward town to hunt. That's a funnier joke in rural Georgia. And there was a salvation specialist that was brought in. I remember him being just kind of a giant of a man who pulled his coat off. It caused Bible pages to rustle over the first few pages. And he preached an amazingly scary sermon about the afterlife and about hell and the possibility of me becoming a rotisserie item in the afterlife. I made a very narcissistic decision, thinking I want none of that, and went down front and said the right thing. For 2 decades, I referenced that as the time that I got saved. It was not. There was nothing about that experience that made me want to pull up a chair with the Trinity. It was an image of God that was grotesque. And John 17:3 would remain a mystery for me for a couple of decades. That was then, and for me, about 20 years ago, was now. Vision. I didn't have a vision of what John 17:3 was all about. Next slide, intention with our Vim model. And since you already see his name, let's go ahead and do the clip in just a second. I need some help with intention, and Johnny Cash is going to provide that. He's going to sing a song, some of you may know, it's called Hurt. It was written by 9 Inch Nails, actually. He sings it, I know. He sings it, I sort of know, not really. He sings it, and it's haunting, and it's almost a eulogy of his life story. He sings it just a few months, I think, before he dies. So Johnny Cash singing his eulogy. The reason I want to play that is because intention is so hard to talk about. Dallas Willard, quote number 2, says he does not trust any program for Christian spiritual formation that doesn't resemble AA. I'll call it synonymous. How come? Because what's the first step? I give up. So Johnny Cash's life is well chronicled as someone who battled with addictions and so forth, and he's singing his own eulogy here, in a sense. And at the end, there's that intentionality of, if I would give anything to start over, to do it all again. I think the vim of Christian spiritual formation involves that level of willingness to do anything. It isn't arguing about who knows the best arrangements for various atonement theories. It isn't arguing about arrangements. It's living the life, whatever it takes to live a very different kind of life. Frank Laubach got that. Most of you probably are aware of Frank Laubach. He was a missionary to the Philippines. I mentioned his name once in a smaller group, maybe 20 years ago, and a little lady in the back of the room shrieked. And she says, Frank Laubach, she says, I worked with him for 20 years. So she verifies these stories. Frank Laubach was a missionary to the Philippines. He not only had planted churches, he had planted seminaries. He had the best of education. And in his mid-40s, he had written in his diary, my life has become a rotting tree. And one fateful New Year's Eve, he decided, well, I'm going to be more intentional this year about doing something about that. I think it might help me, Frank Laubach talking, if I was more aware of being in the presence of God, Jesus, the Trinity. And so he set up a game that was published hundreds of thousands of copies later called A Game with Minutes. It's a little bit obsessive compulsive, but it was also a pretty neat thing to do. He said, I'm going to try to think about Jesus once a minute. He wasn't able to do that, but he did by building several things in his life, such as every time I take a swallow of water, I'm going to take 15 seconds to think about the fact that I live in the presence of the Trinity. Every time I look at another person and see their eyes, I'm going to be reminded that God is in them, the Imago Dei, Christ is in that person. When we have our meals, I'm going to leave an empty chair at the table as a reminder of God's presence. Read his diary. It's called Letters of a Modern Mystic. And by around March 21st, he's saying things like, I have found the great artesian well of joy. Well, what's he doing? He's pulled up a chair to the table where the Trinity sit and is making that part of everyday life. For the church of the first few centuries, spirituality was living all of one's life, all the mundane parts of one's life in communion with God. And Laubach, what he did with his game with minutes takes us to means. So the last letter for our word here, vim, is means. Means, methods, resources for accomplishing something. For Christian spiritual formation, the teachings of Christ found in Scripture, being exposed to classic devotional writings, the practice of Christian disciplines, the invoking of the power, the presence of Jesus in our lives, are means to authentic Christian transformation. Looking at the next slide, there are various classic lists. This list comes from the book Celebration of Discipline by Richard Foster. You may have had it in classes here. And that's one way of thinking about it in a good way. Inward disciplines, outward disciplines, corporate disciplines. But I want to do it something different with you. I want to give you 3 disciplines to experiment with, if you're willing, this week that aren't on the list exactly here. First involves drinking a cup of coffee, preferably Starbucks, but the coffee bean coffee, that will do as well. But I want you to go to your favorite coffee place, might be a corner of the DC, but anyway, have a cup of coffee. And as you drink it, you say this prayer. The warmth of this cup settles me, speaks to me, and reminds me of the warmth of your love. As I hold the cup against my cheek, I listen, hushed and still. I feel the warmth of the coffee sliding down my throat and pray that I may also drink in your great life into the very center of my being. Do that, and you've turned drinking a cup of coffee into spiritual discipline. I'll say more on why that's true later, but it doesn't have to be dusty. You know, John Ortberg's favorite statement was he wasn't too happy when he heard about the 12 disciplines Richard Foster talked about in Celebration of Discipline because he thought, great, 12 more things to not do and feel guilty about. No, I think the disciplines have to be made very practical. Let me give you another one. I mentioned I'm just getting to know this community, so I don't know you that well. Everything has been so positive. I feel incredibly fortunate to be here. One time someone asked me just off the cuff, what do you think about Westmont? I think it's wonderful. But a phrase came out of my mouth that kind of surprised me. I would kind of describe it, from what little I know, as kind of a laid-back drivenness. I don't know if that communicates or not. But you guys seem to be in a hurry to get places, to careers and change the world and do all this wonderful stuff. And you need drive. I would encourage you to add a second discipline, just as an experiment this week. Every time that you look at a watch, if you remember what those are, or because of or your iPhone with a clock on it, or a clock on a wall, take 15 seconds and say to yourself, or say to Jesus, I'm not in a hurry because you're with me. Interesting thing about Jesus, he never seemed to get in a hurry. It's odd, really. He waited 4,000 years after the fall to show up. Then he spent 30 years just kind of hanging out, learning a vocation. And then when he finally got started, he spent half that time camping. And you can't say that Jesus was ever in a hurry. He must have known some secret of being energized by the power and the presence of the Trinity. Simple prayer, I'm not in a hurry because you're with me. Third thing, this one's a little bit more complex, but I think I'm still going to finish on time. Long time ago, when my oldest daughter was, I think, 6 or 7, she mentioned that she wanted to play basketball, and I was delighted because I realized, because she's pretty athletic. She had finished second in a state swimming competition for her age group, and I was thinking, this is great. She was tall, athletic. I was thinking, finally, I can live out some of my athletic fantasies through her, just like parenthood is supposed to be. And but she never touched a basketball. So, and the tryouts were the next day. So we went outside. We were living in Norfolk, Virginia Beach area, and threw some basketballs up on the roof and to demonstrate rebounding, and we did some dribbling, and most of it went off of her foot, but we were trying. And we showed up at the tryouts. They lasted for quite a while, 50, 60 kids there. That very night, I got a call from the commission saying that she was on a team, and they'd asked me to coach. I couldn't believe it. These people were amazing. They not only saw her athletic ability, but my coaching skills, and I was just standing there watching. So I get to the first practice with my 7 players, and I realize what happened. I had the 7 kids that no one else wanted. It was kind of a competitive league, and they didn't get taken on other teams. And those are pretty good reasons. The Bad News Bears would have trounced them at any stage of the movie. They were pretty bad. 3 of them were like my daughter, Jessie, and they just had athletic potential. They just never played basketball before. They were tall. 4 of them were 4 of the most hyperactive kids I've ever seen in my life. Don't mean that mean, I'm just trying to be descriptive. They were a blur of motion. We had our first game, and we got beat 48-0. This is true. I'm not preaching. This really happened. No. So, sorry. So anyway, I call a friend who's a very successful high school, earlier in his career, but at that time, college basketball coach, and tell him my dilemma. And so we come up with a plan. And so the next game, we roll out a defense that we later called the triangle and hyper defense. We put the 3 kids that were tall and could stand still in a triangle under the basket. And it's tough for 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds to shoot over tall kids with hands in the air. But that wasn't the genius. The genius was we put 2 hyperactive kids on whoever was dribbling the basketball. Yeah, you're thinking about that, and that's good, because if you're thinking about that, Michael Jordan couldn't travel the length of this court with 2 hyperactive kids swatting at the basketball. Next game, we only got beat 10-0. The defense was working. And all I had to do, and it got a little bit better, it was 8-0 and 6-0, and it kept getting better and better. All I had to do was just call all the parents, at least of the 4 kids, before the big game and say, don't ask me how I know, just don't give your kid Ritalin until after the game. No, I didn't do that. I didn't do that. And we did have a problem with fouls, but I didn't care. I had 2 more on the bench. The last game of the season, we won 2-1, and it was absolute pandemonium. The other team scored on a foul shot, and I forget how we scored. I think one of the hyperactive kids dribbled the ball so hard it went in the basket. Now, the reason I'm telling you that story, I got to be mindful of time here. Before calling my friend, I was driving around the streets of Virginia Beach, Norfolk, and I was a radio program came on. They were advertising something you could win if you're the 3rd caller. I didn't want whatever you could win, but I did know what I wanted. I wanted to win a contest where Mike Krzyzewski or someone like that would show up at my doorstep for 30 minutes every day. And then an amazing thing hit me. I've already won that contest, and so has everyone in this room. The most amazing life coach in the universe available 24 hours a day. But what if we never stop and listen? Or what if we make an appointment and talk? We do what I've just done, and we do all of the talking. I want to talk to you. The last discipline I want you to experiment with, if you're willing, is listening prayer. If we've got the John passage behind me, John 10, 1-5, and then 10. Very truly I tell you, anyone who does not enter the sheepfold by the gate but climbs in by another way is a thief and a bandit. The one who enters the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all of his own, he goes ahead of them. The sheep follow him because they know his voice. They will not follow a stranger, but they will run from him because they do not know the voice of strangers. Then skipping to verse 10, the thief comes to steal and kill and destroy, but I come that you may have life and have it abundantly. Briefly, imagine two radio sending towers. One is over here. We won't go to the next slide just yet, but one is over here, and it's station WGOD. I'll call it channel 1. Over here, WSIN, channel 2. And they're broadcasting 24 hours a day. And I want to give you just a couple of things that have worked for me. And I actually heard this verse from a pastor, Peter Lord, who wrote it in a book called Hearing God. We're going to do a bit of a truncated version. But I'm saying that if you quiet yourself and you ask a question, you will hear one of 3 radio stations. We're not going to talk about WSLF, your own stream of consciousness. But it can be a pretty good thing to start trying to tease out, how am I hearing, and do I know the difference between channel 1 and channel 2? In rapid fire fashion, 1, the nature of the approach. Channel 1, in my opinion, will most likely sound like the voice of a shepherd that is leading and inviting, as opposed to a cattle driver. But most importantly, arguably, it's invited. If you're walking across campus and all of a sudden a voice plays in your head, why did you say that to that person? You're always saying stuff like that. That's so stupid. Will you ever, stop. Did you invite that, or did that voice come over the wall of the sheep pen? So was the voice invited, or did it make an illegal entrance? Second thing, content. I'm proposing that channel 1, broadcasting into your thought life, is more likely to propose inner solutions. That I'd be getting along with the roommate a whole lot better if I make some changes, not if they make some changes. Why would channel 1 tell you about something someone else needs to do? It's incredibly frustrating because there's nothing you can do about that. I think if God had a calling card, it probably would have either grace of mercy written on it. If the voice playing in your head is dripping in mercy, I'm more likely to suspect channel 1. No mercy, channel 2. But what about when we mess up? Well, that's right. It's not all grace. I expect channel 1 to correct me of a specific behavior. I expect broad condemnation from channel 2. And I expect channel 1 to be more about peacemaking than division. Last 2 slides. I'm pretty convinced that I know some people that channel 2 has told them they need to either take a boatload of Bibles to China or build an orphanage in a foreign country. Well, how can that possibly be? Simple. Life is just a bunch of present moments. If I'm caught up in something that's taking me away from right now, I'll need to be pretty suspicious of that. Because if I live my whole life in the future, as these people are in the 2 cases that I won't go into, or in the past with regret and so forth, I'm not here. The only place where life is happening. I expect channel 1 to say things to me that are more likely grounded in the now, that are practical and mundane and simple and definite, as opposed to future focus, past focus, overly sensational or complicated. Last thing. What's the emotional impact of the content? And I'll just do the first line because it's what really matters. You quiet yourself with that cup of coffee and you ask a question and you hear a thought broadcast in your head. What do you feel afterwards? What was the emotional impact? Was it like that of the fruit of the Spirit? More loving, peaceful, joyful, or just the opposite? To me, this is the main takeaway value. What's the emotional impact after the communication? I want to invite you to take 30 seconds and do this. And close your eyes if you want. You don't have to. But I'd like for you to ask the simple question to God, what do you think of me? And then ask yourself why you think that you heard from channel 1 or channel 2, or maybe just your own stream of consciousness. The third discipline I propose this week is just to do a little bit more of that. I have 45 seconds to wrap this up, so here we go, last slide. George MacDonald said, well, before we leave the slide, what's a Christian discipline? Anything that you can do with your thoughts, your feelings, body, social relationships that makes the center of who you are more open and permeable to the power and presence of God. The things that we do that open up our heart. George MacDonald said, life and religion are one, or neither is anything. He also said, to know God by knowing Christ, that is salvation, that is redemption, and nothing else is. Thank you for being patient with me. And Ben said, if I don't stop by 11:20, I'm fired. So, Ben, please, go in peace.